The Ffestiniog Railway, based at the harbour station in picturesque Porthmadog, is the oldest surviving railway company in the world. It is a narrow gauge working railway, is roughly 13.5 miles long, is a very popular tourist destination and runs through stunning forested and mountainous scenery to the slate mining town of Ffestiniog. Although it is a commercial operation and employs many full and part-time staff, it relies heavily on an army of enthusiastic, unpaid volunteers.
Volunteers work in a number of different ways. One of the things that the Ffestiniog Railway Society does is because the people who join the society are interested in the railway, we provide somewhere between 300 and 500 volunteers, and then there are other volunteers come from different areas. Most of the footplate crew, most of the guards, many of the onboard train staff will be volunteers. People who work in our carriage works and engineering works, there's a small full-time paid team, but largely they're volunteers as well. So we have probably anywhere up to 1,000 volunteers who come and do various bits and pieces for us. Top right-hand corner. I'm John Fenner. I'm a seasonal member of paid staff on the railway, but the railway also has a volunteer supporter society, and I'm the secretary for the society as well. And I also do a winter maintenance job as a volunteer on the railway. I still am, technically, a Methodist minister. I'm very often the first person that people will encounter when they come to the railway, all the way through to back office paperwork that nobody ever sees but gets done by me. Be here by 9:15.
Yes.
And there's every chance you'll get on here. Good. I've been around the railway since 1969. It's kind of seeped into me. It was originally thought about in the early 1820s, and an Act of Parliament to build the railway was passed in 1832. That's just 2 years after the Liverpool-Manchester Railway opened. And the idea was to make it possible to bring slate from Ffestiniog up in the northeast down to the port in a safe manner. Before the railway was here, it had to be transshipped several times from donkey carts into flat-bottom boats, back onto carts, before finally being placed on ships to be sailed out. And that meant there was a lot of wastage. The railway managed to produce a single point of transfer to the port and became very, very successful. So it opened in 1836 as a horse-drawn tramway. By 1860, that was an impractical way of shipping the slate because there was so much of it. So they developed a system of steam locomotives. And in fact, this railway, the Ffestiniog, was the first narrow gauge railway in the world to have steam locomotives. It was the start of all the narrow gauge steam railways in the world. The railway was very cunningly designed. When it was a horse-drawn tramway, there was a gradient all the way, a downhill gradient all the way from Ffestiniog down to Porthmadog, and the horses were used to pull the empty wagons up, and then they would run a gravity train down, so it would just run with brakesmen sat precariously on the wagons. But because the loads got too heavy, we pioneered steam locomotives. George Stephenson said at one point it wasn't possible to build a steam locomotive the size that we required for our gauge railway, but a company in London built the first Pioneers, and we still have 3 of those original locomotives. This railway was extremely revolutionary in industrialising the slate industry. The technology in terms of the original steam engines was also exported around the world, so the very famous Indian Hill railways were all made successful on the back of what we pioneered here. In the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, a lot of the landscape the railway now travels through was actually very industrial. You wouldn't get that impression by simply looking out at the various forests and agricultural landscape that we now travel through. But some of the other things you will see, what was Britain's only inland nuclear power station at Ffestiniog, very visible on the upper section of the line. That's now a redundant power station, so it no longer generates electricity. But further up the line, and part of the railway's history, was the site for the Shergold Dam pumped storage scheme, which is where they developed and tested all the technology that later went into building Electric Mountain over at Llanberis. It's a pumped storage hydroelectric scheme, which means that they have an upper dam where they keep the water and it flows down through underground pipes to turn the generators. When they no longer need that water, they pump it back up the hill with the spare electricity. Starting off at Portmadog, the very first thing you see and cross is the sea wall that's called the Cob. That wall was a brainchild of William Maddox, who was the MP for Boston in Lincolnshire, and he had a family resort out here. He had a vision for creating the port of Portmadog, and in order to get sufficient depth, they had to, and also to drain land inland, they had to build this sea wall. It runs for almost a mile and is the only flat bit of the railway running across the Glaslyn estuary. Once you get to the other end, there's Boston Lodge. It's called Boston Lodge because William Maddox was the MP for Boston in Lincolnshire, as I said, but that's where the engineering works for the railway is. And at Boston Lodge, the railway turns to go inland and begins its steady climb from sea level to just over 700 foot above sea level by the time it reaches Ffestiniog. The line is dotted with bits of railway history. The next station after Boston Lodge is Minforth. It's a place where our trains pass. It's also an interchange with the Network Rail main line, and back in the past history, it was a place where the Great Western Railway had an interchange siding and would take slate from us. Going further up the hill and the line, there's the village of Penryn. That was an important community before Portmadog existed and kind of declined after Portmadog was built. We get into what is now the forest, and Plas Halt as a late development private railway to serve Plas Tannaborth, which is the National Park Study Centre. It was the home of the Oakley family, who were big quarry owners in Ffestiniog, and is claimed to be, I think with some fairly accurate claim, the first house in North Wales to have electric lighting. The owner, William Oakley, had a lake built that he gave to his daughter as a birthday present, but the real reason for having the lake was so he could have a dam on it and get a fall of water to power his turbine, so that his family could be at the cutting edge of technology. Then we go through into a new bit of railway after the remote hamlet of Ddiach. When the current railway people were reopening the railway after it had been abandoned, the old track bed had been flooded by the lower lake of the Shergold Dam system. So in the 1960s and 70s we had to build a whole new 1.5 mile stretch of railway, and that was my first bit of engagement with the line back in 1969 through to 1975, when I was among a team of people who would literally work like navvies did on the original railway constructions. Our old line used to go straight on from the Ddiach station, but in order to get round the back of the generating station on the Stulan Dam system, we had to gain 60 foot in height, and we couldn't do that going straight forwards. So the engineers who worked out the route for the new bit of railway came up with this scheme of building a loop round a small hill called Black Hill, Via, and that gained sufficient height to be able to then go round the back of the lake without the railway line flooding. We pass around the back of the Stulan Dam generator and Tanagrisha, a small mining community, making the final run into blind Ffestiniog, which for people who've never been there comes as something of a shock, because they've been going through forest and arable farmland and they suddenly find themselves surrounded by mounds of waste slate, because for every ton of usable slate that came out of the quarries there was 10 tons of waste that was tipped, and that's all largely still in place.
Thanks to John for his valued contribution and assistance during our visit. Please look out for our other short films online. If you have an interesting story to tell, please get in touch. Thanks for watching.